All right, let's get started with chapter D5 on hormones and metabolism. Okay, so hormones come from endocrine glands, okay? Different than exocrine glands. We'll go back over those in a moment, but endocrine glands are going to secrete hormones, and hormones go into the bloodstream. So some common examples of hormone secreting glands: the pancreas, the pituitary, the thyroid. Okay, it's super important to remember that hormones go everywhere. They travel in your blood, and so they may pick up on a target cell that has a specific receptor for that hormone, but any cell that receives blood is going to eventually run into that hormone. Now, exocrine glands, which we've talked about previously, are very different. So these guys are secreting things like digestive enzymes or sweat through a duct, okay? So they go to a specific place. They don't go into the blood. They go to a specific place. So we talked about the pancreas again. So the pancreas is both an endocrine and an exocrine gland. It secretes hormones into the blood like insulin and glucagon, but it also secretes things like pancreatic amylase into the small intestine through that common bile duct. So have to be very careful here on the difference between endocrine and exocrine glands. So since this chapter is all about hormones, we're going to be focusing on common endocrine glands. So here are a few that you need to know. Okay, the pituitary, holy moly, we're going to talk a lot about this guy. Okay, it's a small gland deep within the brain. The thyroid, which we've talked about before, okay, located right here in that throat area. Your adrenal glands, and those are sitting right up on top of your kidney. Your pancreas, this ugly little organ here, okay, kind of in your gut. And then in males and females, we're going to have abdominal endocrine glands, either the ovaries in a female or the testes in a male. Again, endocrine glands, okay, secreting their hormones all throughout the bloodstream. Okay, so we're going to find that there are two types of hormones. And those two types are peptide hormones and steroid hormones. Let's talk about steroid hormones first. So if I told you that this little guy here is a steroid hormone, and this is the plasma membrane or the cell membrane, then we should be able to kind of tell what's going on in this picture. So one of the cool properties about steroid hormones is that they are able to get across this cell membrane. And when they cross in with this cell membrane, they're going to hook up with a receptor protein. Now, once they hook up with a receptor protein, okay, here's a steroid cell membrane, okay, they form what's called a receptor hormone complex. Okay, this receptor hormone complex goes into this area, which is the nucleus. And once it's there, it's going to bind to a gene or a section of DNA, and it's going to act as a promoter. So we've learned about that before. These promoters can cause the transcription and translation. So again, once it's inside the nucleus, and it gets there by passing through a nuclear pore, this receptor complex is going to bind to this DNA and promote the transcription, so this must be mRNA here, and translation of that gene, which is eventually going to end up with a polypeptide. Okay, now it's this polypeptide that's going to cause whatever change we wanted the steroid hormone to cause in the first place. Okay, but all this did was basically bind with this receptor to promote this transcription and translation process to produce that polypeptide. Now, as we just said, one of the great things about steroid hormones is that they are able to cross the cell membrane to bind with that receptor protein. And the reason that they're able to do this is because they're lipids. They're made from cholesterol, and since they're lipids, they're going to be nonpolar, and they're going to pass easily through the cell membrane. So again, just to recap here, the steroid hormone is going to enter the cell directly through the lipid bilayer of the membrane. It then binds to a receptor protein to form what's called the receptor hormone complex. That receptor hormone complex is then going to enter the nucleus through a nuclear pore. Once it's inside the nucleus, it is going to bind to a section of DNA that activates that particular gene, or that gene that makes the desired polypeptide. Then we're going to go through transcription to make mRNA and translation to make the polypeptide. Okay, so now the hormone doesn't actually transcribe anything. Okay, that's RNA polymerase. And it doesn't actually translate anything. That's the job of the ribosomes. All it does is it promotes that transcription and translation process. So it kind of like acts like an activator, and it turns on that protein making process. There are lots of steroid hormones, okay? The ones that we're probably going to spend the most time on in the next few weeks are testosterone and estrogen. Now, other examples of steroid hormones can include what we call PEDs, or performance-enhancing drugs. And we hear a lot about those being used illegally by lots of athletes. And we knew why they do it, right? So increased muscle mass, strength, speed, getting a competitive advantage. However, they must not be biology students, okay? Because hormones don't just go to a specific place where they're desired. Hormones travel all throughout the bloodstream. And so any cell that has that target receptor protein is going to be affected by that hormone. And as such, that kind of wide distribution can cause a whole ton of crappy side effects like acne, vision problems, high blood pressure, insomnia, disqualification, probably death. Not a fun time if you ask me. Okay, so let's move on to the second type of hormones, which are these peptide hormones. Automatically when I say that, you should know what that means, but if not, nod and smile and pretend like you do. Okay, and let's go ahead and label this picture. So again, I see the plasma membrane or cell membrane. Okay, this purple border around the cell. And this little guy right here is the peptide hormone. Isn't he adorable? Okay, so kind of like that adorable stray dog in your neighborhood. It's kind of cute to look at, but it's not allowed in the cell. Notice that this guy doesn't get into the cell anywhere. So how do these things work? Well, this peptide hormone is going to bond or bind with a receptor. And I don't have that labeled on here, but if you wanted to add that, you could. Okay, this is a receptor. And once this hormone binds with the receptor, it's going to initiate a series of like relay races here. And the first one is carried by what we call a secondary messenger. Okay, so this secondary messenger is going to take this message, really, of what this peptide hormone wants to do, and it's then going to pass it onto more messenger molecules. And finally, when it gets down the line, one of our final messenger molecules is going to be able to enter the nucleus through these gaps, again, called nuclear pores. So here's the nucleus, okay, this whole area here. Okay, here's the nuclear pore, so it's going to come in through the nuclear pore, and then it's going to do the same thing that those steroid hormones does. Okay, it's either going to promote, or I guess it could suppress a gene. Okay, so once it's in the nucleus, the action is the same. It promotes the transcription and translation. How that message gets there is a little different though, because this peptide hormone, notice, isn't going into the cell. It has to pass its message to a series of messenger molecules. And I don't know why. I thought to label the cell membrane twice. I don't know. I guess you should probably know that by now. So peptide hormones are, of course, composed of polypeptides or proteins. They are long strings of amino acids, okay? And as such, they can't pass into the cell, okay? So that's why they have to kind of pass their message off to this receptor. These guys are not able to go into the cell. Some common examples here include insulin and ADH, okay, which we talked about with the kidneys, which makes that collecting duct in the nephrons more permeable. So insulin being produced by the pancreas, of course, which is why the pancreas is full of ribosomes, because it's got to produce insulin, and insulin is a protein. All right, so just to summarize here, so the peptide hormone is going to bond to a receptor protein on the target cell's outer membrane. It does not get to go into the cell. The secondary messenger molecule is triggered into action. That secondary messenger molecule is going to pass the message on to one or more messenger molecules that are also in the cytoplasm. So like a giant game, or I guess a really small game actually, of Whisper Down the Lane. The final messenger is going to do one of two things. It's either going to activate an enzyme in the cytoplasm to initiate a reaction that couldn't have occurred without the hormone, or it can act as a transcription factor. So this is exactly like what we talked about with the steroid hormones. Okay, this is a little bit different. So it may not necessarily go into the nucleus. It may decide just to stay out here in the cytoplasm and do its thing. Okay, so we can think of these hormones as either being messengers that can cause things to happen within a cell, okay, or things that can promote or turn off genes within the nucleus. All right, so let's dive a little deeper into one of the most fascinating glands of the body, okay, which is the pituitary. So the pituitary is this thing here that kind of looks like testicles, but they're not. They're tiny little glands within your brain, and they are stuck to this gland right here called the hypothalamus. Okay, so the hypothalamus is right up here, the pituitary right here. You're going to notice that the pituitary has two lobes, okay? Anterior facing the front of the head, and then posterior facing the rear. Okay, so if we take a little bit more of an in-depth view, we're going to see that the anterior and posterior pituitary are connected to the hypothalamus in ridiculously different ways. So let's see what we're looking at here. This guy up top is the hypothalamus. Okay, so this area up in here. This area is actually the anterior pituitary. And I only mention that because we want to kind of like forget that that exists for a couple moments and focus on just this posterior pituitary. So extending from the hypothalamus into the posterior pituitary are these things called neurosecretory cells. Okay, and neurosecretory cells are going to do exactly what they sound like. They're going to secrete things into the posterior pituitary. So here is the posterior, oh my gosh, that's terrible. Posterior pituitary. All right, now the posterior pituitary then can secrete those hormones through the bloodstream, through these blood vessels. Okay, so the hypothalamus actually produces the hormone. It then just sends them down this little water slide of neurosecretory cells, and then the posterior pituitary will then send it to the rest of the body through these blood vessels. So it's kind of like Amazon. Amazon doesn't make anything. They just get things from other people who make things and then ship them to you. It's exactly what the posterior pituitary does. So a couple of examples of hormones produced by the posterior pituitary. So we've talked about ADH before, antidiuretic hormone, that affects the kidneys. And then one that we're going to talk about quite a bit, which I don't know why I left you such a small box, sorry, which is oxytocin. Okay, so again, these are things that are going to be produced by the hypothalamus, but distributed to the rest of the body via the posterior pituitary. Now, these neurosecretory cells are just specialized nerve cells, okay? So you may note, like, they kind of look like that, right? They have this long part to them. That's the axon, just like in a regular nerve cell that you already know. So this posterior pituitary contains the axons of those cells, but those neurosecretory cells originate in the hypothalamus. So again, we have to be very careful about how we're using verbs like produce and secrete. Okay, so the hypothalamus actually produces those hormones like oxytocin and ADH. It moves through the neurosecretory cells into the pituitary, and then the pituitary releases those hormones to the rest of the body through the bloodstream. Now, the way that the anterior pituitary interacts with the hypothalamus is completely different. Okay, so here's the hypothalamus up here. We already know that, yeah. Okay, and here are some more of those neurosecretory cells. Okay, but you're going to notice that they don't extend all the way into the anterior pituitary. So here is the anterior pituitary, okay, so like facing your face. Okay, these neurosecretory cells don't extend all the way down in here. Now, they do produce something. Okay, and that something tells the anterior pituitary what to do, but they're not directly connected. Okay, so these neurosecretory cells have to release their products into this blood vessel, which only goes into the anterior pituitary. It doesn't go to the rest of the body. It only goes here to the anterior pituitary, and these are called portal blood vessels. So we talked about a portal vein with the liver, yeah? So something going from your small intestine to your liver. Oh my gosh, that's the world's worst drawing. Okay, it's like a one-way street. Same thing here. The portal blood vessel that connects the neurosecretory cells in the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary, they don't share that blood supply with anything else. So here's a little bit about how this works. Okay, a hormone gets secreted by the neurosecretory cell, transported through the portal blood vessel. It then triggers these cells in the anterior pituitary to produce their own hormone, whatever the heck that may be, so something different. Okay, and then that anterior pituitary is going to release it. So whatever's released by the anterior pituitary was actually made there, unlike the posterior. And it's made because of a chemical signal it's getting originally from the hypothalamus. So some things from here include TSH. Why can't I write an S? TSH. TSH affects the thyroid and its function. And then we have FSH and LH. You should have guessed that already. If you did, I'm super proud of you. Okay, so we know from previous chapters that the hypothalamus produces GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone. That tells the anterior pituitary to produce and secrete FSH and LH. So that's kind of how that interaction is working. Some more examples are GH, or growth hormone. We'll talk more about that later. And something called prolactin. Okay, this should be a giveaway here that it's talking about milk, so we're in the mammary glands. Okay, now let's forget about my nonsensical scribbling for just a moment and actually go through this. So the anterior pituitary actually produces the hormones that it secretes. So those neurosecretory cells are entirely within the hypothalamus. They don't extend down into that anterior pituitary, but they do release a series of hormones called releasing hormones, like GnRH, and they travel through that portal blood vessel to the anterior pituitary. They're just bossy hormones. That's all they are. They don't actually do anything to the rest of the body. All they do is they target specific cells in the anterior pituitary, and they tell those cells what to produce. Just like GnRH from the hypothalamus tells the anterior pituitary to produce LH and FSH. Okay, so these are just bossy hormones. Then, once the anterior pituitary secretes or produces those hormones, it'll release them into the bloodstream. So we really have to be careful here when we're using these words produced by and secreted by, because anything that is secreted by the posterior pituitary was actually produced by the hypothalamus. Okay, so produced, secreted. Okay, things that are secreted by the anterior pituitary are both produced and secreted here. Okay, now here's kind of where this anterior and posterior pituitary do a little bit of a 180 on us. So I'm going to draw a face. Don't judge me. That's a face. Okay, and in this person's brain are the pituitary lobes. That is way out of proportion. They're not that big. All right, I'm going to label them. This one is the anterior pituitary. So anterior meaning closest to the front, and then we have posterior, closest to the rear. Now, as we're talking about milk secretion, our person needs to be a biological female. So we're going to give her a breast and a stomach and nipples. Okay, so we have a couple of different things going on in the breast, kind of here in this interior part. This is where milk production occurs. And more towards the exterior in the nipple, this is where milk secretion occurs. Okay? Now, the problem here is that the posterior and anterior pituitary kind of do this crisscross, okay? So the posterior pituitary actually secretes oxytocin, which is responsible for milk secretion, while the anterior pituitary secretes prolactin, which is going to have more to do with milk production. So they kind of do this crisscross here. Of course, these are hormones, so they're all throughout the blood. But in our thinking, okay, it's a little bit backwards. So the anterior pituitary closest to the front is actually responsible for the behind-the-scenes milk production with prolactin, while the posterior pituitary closest to the back is actually responsible for the muscle contractions that are responsible for milk secretion. Okay, so women have milk-producing cells in their breast tissue. It's one of the many reasons why they're different than biological men. Okay, so these milk-producing cells are present, but they're not really well developed. So during pregnancy, prolactin is going to increase, which causes these milk-producing cells to develop. So that development happens during pregnancy. After birth, prolactin levels are going to increase and cause these milk-producing cells to increase even more and start producing milk. So prolactin, okay, lactose should remind you of milk, okay, and I'm making that milk in those milk-secreting cells. And again, that's going to come from the anterior pituitary. So anterior, hope you can read that. Now, in a minute, we're going to talk about the hormones associated with birth, and oxytocin is going to play a huge role there also. But oxytocin is highly involved with milk secretion, and it works in a positive feedback loop. Okay, so how does that work? Well, during birth, the estrogen levels that are really high during pregnancy are going to drop, and that's going to trigger oxytocin levels to increase. And again, this is going to come from the posterior pituitary. All right, so the oxytocin causes a muscle contraction in the nipple to literally squeeze the milk out of the nipple. So we call that milk ejection or milk secretion. And that continues through the suckling action of the infant. So that physical stimulation causes the posterior pituitary to secrete even more oxytocin, which causes even more milk ejection, which causes the baby to suckle even harder, which causes this continual feedback loop. Okay, more suckling, more milk, more oxytocin, more suckling, okay, on and on and on. And this is going to continue for as long as the woman is breastfeeding the child. So it's one of the reasons why when a woman doesn't breastfeed for quite some time, that milk production, milk secretion turns off because it relies on the actual breastfeeding to secrete or trigger the secretion of the oxytocin from the posterior pituitary. Now, there are some other pituitary gland hormones that we should know. One of them should be a review here, I guess two of them. So we have luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. And those, of course, you should remember to help trigger the follicle development, that Graafian follicle. And at their peak, at about day 14 in the menstrual cycle, trigger ovulation. And these, of course, are both anterior pituitary hormones. Growth hormone, or GH, is another anterior pituitary hormone, and what it does is it triggers an increase in the rate of mitosis, leading to growth. So oftentimes, if you think about like the world's tallest person or world's tallest man or woman, one of the reasons why they're so tall is they can actually have a tumor in the pituitary that's causing that pituitary gland to release too much growth hormone, and they continue to grow, which might sound nice if you love to play basketball, but it can cause some major physiological problems. Okay, and then finally, let's throw back to one of our posterior pituitary hormones. So again, produced by the hypothalamus, but secreted by the posterior pituitary. And that is ADH, or antidiuretic hormone. So when ADH is secreted, it makes the collecting duct of the nephron permeable to water. So water is going to leave the collecting duct and go back into the bloodstream instead of being eliminated as urine. When I don't have ADH, that collecting duct is impermeable, okay, meaning that we have plenty of water, so that extra water that was in the filtrate doesn't go back into our bloodstream, it just passes straight through and becomes urine. Okay, so again, I'm going to encourage you one more time to make sure that you understand that in the anterior pituitary, it both produces and secretes those hormones, and you need to be able to list examples. The posterior pituitary only secretes them. They're produced in the hypothalamus. And again, we want to put these examples in our memory bank also. And that'll do it for Chapter D5 on hormones.